This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by Verso Books, which has loads of great left-wing titles, perfect for Dig listeners like you. One that you might like is The Automatic Fetish by Beverly Best. Best has reinvented Capital Volume 3. So says Frederick Jameson, at least. In this new book, she traces Marx's analysis of capital step by step through the material compiled posthumously as the third volume of Capital. Neither a return to basics nor a newfangled reconstruction. The Automatic Fetish shows once again that Marx rewards careful study. Colleen Lai, co-editor of After Marx, says, "If I had to choose one book that would make the case for the relevance of Marx's critique of political economy to the humanities, this might very well be it." Listeners can buy The Automatic Fetish by Beverly Best at versobooks.com and save 40% at checkout using discount code DIG. That's capital D-I-G. Welcome to The Dig, a podcast from Jacobin Magazine. My name is Daniel Denver, and I'm broadcasting from Providence, Rhode Island. This is the 12th episode of Thawra, the Dig's rolling series on 20th century Arab politics, with historian Abdel Razzaq Takriti. Thawra is Arabic for revolution. It's a word that contains historical multitudes, diverse political radicalisms and revolts that have swept across Arab lands over the past century. We've spent recent episodes laying out the tumultuous revolutionary processes in Egypt, Syria, and Iraq. A brief recapitulation. In 1958, Nasser's stratospheric leadership brought Egypt and Syria into one superstate, the United Arab Republic. Later that year, a free officers movement led by Abdul Karim Qasim overthrew Iraq's imperialist-aligned Hashemite monarchy, a revolution that also brought the Iraqi Communist Party to the heights of power, a power they also used to violently overreach against their rivals, namely the Ba'ath. These revolutionary projects did not last long. In 1961, a military coup pulled Syria out of the United Arab Republic. In February 1963, the Ba'ath and other nationalists overthrew Qasim's government in Iraq, and the Baathists unleashed a campaign of bloody terror against the communists. In March 1963, Syrian Baathists seized power in a coup. In November 1963, Iraqi nationalists ousted their one-time Baathist allies from power. In 1966, the Syrian Ba'ath Military Committee, led by figures like Salah Jadid and Hafiz al-Assad, launched a coup that sidelined Ba'ath traditional leadership, people like Michel Aflaq and Saladin al-Battar. This history we've been telling is rife with vehement and often violent splits of all sorts between Syrian and Iraqi Baathists and among Syrian and Iraqi Baathists, and there will be more such conflicts to come. This installment of Thawra, as we near the end of the series, turns our analytical lens southward to the Arabian Peninsula, starting with Saudi Arabia. The Saudi Arabia whose boundaries were finally set by the 1920s was not the birth of a new nation, but in fact the third Saudi state, the final product of a series of powerful territorial conquests, driven by dynastic ambition under a religious banner that rolled across the Arabian Peninsula, events that we discussed at length near the beginning of this series. Up until 1924, the British Empire had prevented Saudi expansion to the Hejaz, the western region of the Arabian Peninsula that's home to the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, and the port of Jeddah. For centuries, the seat of Hashemite power, until Ibn Saud seized it in 1925. Even though British help had been indispensable for consolidating their expansion, the House of Saud hedged their bets by handing the oil concession not to London, but to the U.S. oil company-owned Aramco. They also allowed the U.S. to establish an air base and became Washington's most consistent ally in a still colonized region. And yet, Saudi Arabia had also been an ally of Nasser's throughout much of the 1950s, joining his campaign against the imperialist military alliance called the Baghdad Pact. This was in significant part due to Nasser and Saudi Arabia's shared hostility to the Hashemite monarchies in Jordan and Iraq. But it was also because the politics of Saudi Arabia and of the broader Arab world remained unsettled in the 1950s. King Saud ascended the throne in 1953. Oil revenues were pouring in, but state institutions were rudimentary. King Saud's task was to build the modern Saudi state. Unfortunately, he was not up to the task. The vacuum of decisive leadership at the top, however, created openings for radicals and reformers to advance their agendas. And indeed, in the 1950s, Saudi Arabia was swept by radical political currents, including but extending beyond those that we have spent much of this series discussing. Oil workers mobilized and organized powerful strikes. Oil Minister Abdel Takriti, known as the Red Sheikh, worked to increase state power over the oil industry. In Saudi Arabia and also globally, through his founding and leadership of OPEC. Prince Talal bin Abdulaziz, known as the Red Prince, advocated for a constitutional monarchy and ultimately, and briefly, led a group of so-called free princes from exile. King Saud, however, was no radical, and the balance of power in the royal family increasingly tilted toward his brother, Prince Faisal, a staunch conservative who had the determination and skill to build the modern Saudi state and to lead a region-wide reaction against Arab nationalism and Nasserism. In 1964, Faisal pushed his brother off the throne entirely and took his place. Saud had anyhow long since turned against Nasser, threatened by Nasser's growing regional power and by Republican revolution reaching Iraq in 1958. Anti-colonial revolution was spreading, and imperialist-aligned monarchies seemed at risk of falling like dominoes, all the way to the kingdom's doorstep in North Yemen, where a revolution led by Nasserist officers overthrew the Zaydi Imamate in 1962, sparking a long and brutal civil war that drew in Saudi arms supplied to royalist forces and tens of thousands of Egyptian troops backing the new revolutionary government. An explosion of revolutionary activity across the Arabian Peninsula posed a threat to the Saudi order, and also to the British imperial power that at this time still exercised considerable influence over Kuwait and colonial controls over Bahrain, Qatar, Aden, and also the Trucial States, the small princely states that in 1971 formed the United Arab Emirates after British military withdrawal. Meanwhile, North Yemen's civil war would continue as revolution broke out in Oman and as Marxist revolutionaries took power in South Yemen after the British withdrawal there, both movements emerging from the movement of Arab nationalists, which had spread across the Arabian Peninsula from its powerhouse operation in Kuwait. North Yemen's civil war would continue until the 1967 Arab War with Israel. The war was a disastrous Arab defeat that the fighting in North Yemen, by sapping Egypt's military strength, helped lay the groundwork for. That war also, however, helped spark the Palestinian Revolution, an era of popular armed struggle against Zionist settler colonialism. We'll be covering all of this in the final episodes of Thawra. This episode, though, tells the story of Saudi Arabia's brief openness to Arab nationalism and various currents of radical and reformist change. This is the story of the consolidation of Saudi Arabia as not just a conservative state, but also as a regional vanguard of the reaction that, alongside Zionist and Western imperialist belligerents, would defeat the entire era of Arab and Palestinian revolutionary politics to which we have dedicated this series. This project has been a giant one. This is the history of Arab politics that we think this new internationalist and anti-imperialist solidarity movement needs to make sense of and act in this moment and over the long haul. We put all this work into the podcast because listeners like you voluntarily support us at patreon.com/thedig. We put out every single episode with no paywall because this is a not-for-profit political education project. We want everyone to listen regardless of your ability to pay. We can only do that, though, because those of you who value this podcast and who can afford to contribute do so and make a donation. Maybe that's you listening to me right now. We also have books and tote bags and coffee mugs to send people depending on where you live and how much you contribute. And every contributor gets our newsletter mailed to your email inbox. Everyone, though, can check out our newsletter for free at thedigradio.com. Anyhow, please support us if you can. That's patreon.com/thedig. And a reminder, please let a friend know about Thawra. Or on social media, please let everyone know about Thawra. Lastly, listeners in the UK, I'm coming to London. It will be my first time, and I'll be hosting a live Dig interview on July 26th with Jeremy Corbyn and Laleh Khalili on global politics, internationalism, and the war on Palestine, alongside Verso Podcast's Eleanor Penny. And it is a podcast doubleheader. Before our Dig Verso discussion, Dalia Gabriel will interview Theorio Francos and Asad Rahman on capitalism and the climate crisis for the Macrodose podcast. The event is at Union Chapel, and I'll put a link where you can buy tickets in the show notes. Thanks, and here's Abdel Razzaq Takriti, who teaches history at Rice University. A scholar of Arab and Palestinian revolutionary movements, he's the author of Monsoon Revolution, Republicans, Sultans, and Empires in Oman, and the co-author of the Palestinian Revolution Digital Humanities website, an incredible resource that'll be back online soon. Let's start our discussion of the Arabian Peninsula in its largest country, Saudi Arabia. It's the peninsula's largest state, today also the Arab world's most powerful. And many listeners, I think, they tend to view the kingdom as timelessly reactionary, fundamentalists, and firmly aligned with U.S. imperialism. But in the 1950s, Saudi Arabian politics included radical nationalists and communists in groups like the National Reform Front. There was vibrant local press and radical militant workers leading major strikes, particularly in the oil industry. And notably, King Saud, the person in charge of the whole kingdom who ascended the throne in 1953, King Saud often facilitated or was open to various forms of radical or at least reform politics to a pretty significant extent. And yet, even with King Saud's relative openness, in 1955, there was an attempted free officers coup, which if successful, could have sent Saudi Arabia on a more radical trajectory, similar to Egypt or Iraq. Then there were also royals known as the Saudi Free Princes who proposed reforms to the monarchy. We're going to get into a lot of detail here, but for starters, can you trace the broader forces at work and at war with one another in Saudi Arabia throughout the 1950s? So many different factors seem to be at play. There are regional factors like the Palestinian diaspora and the impact of Nasserism and Nasser's enormous stature across the region, and then also complex domestic dynamics, militant oil workers, homegrown dissident currents, not only in the Hijaz but also in the Najd. Paint this bigger picture. Why were radical currents so ascendant in 1950s Saudi Arabia? After all, this was a kingdom that gave the U.S. its first major imperial foothold in the Middle East through the creation of Aramco, a kingdom whose very creation within its modern-day borders was fundamentally contingent on British imperial power.
Well, Daniel, let's start by articulating the background to the formation of this kingdom. It should be noted that this was the third Saudi state that we're dealing with. And I think we've alluded in previous episodes to the fact that you had a first Saudi state that occurred in the 18th century, And it came about as a result of an alliance between a small town ruler from the Al Saud family and a preacher named Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, who was focused and obsessed with the concept of monotheism. And by the way, you can consult his book on monotheism. It's widely available online. So in that vision, the idea was to combine a religious ideology with earthly concerns of the ruling family. And that alliance proved to be fortuitous for both parties. It produced immense gains for the ideology that was promoted by the preacher as well as the ruling family. So what you had was a development of a very powerful force that relied on a large base of support in the interior of the Arabian Peninsula in a region that is known historically as Najd, Najd. So what happens is that from Najd, the Al Saud family, with the forces that united under it, begin to conquer surrounding regions in the 18th century. And they're able to expand across much of the Arabian Peninsula, and they unify much of that under their banner. And essentially, their narrative is that they were a unifying force, they were a centralizing force. What had existed before them is chaos. What would exist after them is chaos. It's the family that unifies this space and this country. And that's why Saudi Arabia has that strange title that it gains later on. The country is named after the dynasty. It is not like, for example, the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan, which refers to the dynasty, but it's attaching it to the name of the place. In this case, the place is renamed after the dynasty. Now, of course, in fact, in the Arabic name, there is no space referred to in particular. It's referring to the kingdom. So it's the Mamlaka al-Arabiya Saudiya, the Arab Saudi kingdom. Now, I don't want us to obsess about semantics here and what they mean, but of course they do mean something. What they mean is there's this focus on the intertwinement between the fate of the space, the fate of its politics, and the dynasty. And as scholars have recently emphasized, including Rosie Bashir in her new book, Archive Wars, there's a focus there in the new scholarship on the utilization of religion as a matter of convenience as well, as part of this pursuit. It could be reversed at any moment. This obsession in the West of presenting this as some kind of theocracy that is driven by dark religious forces, that's not really what's going on there. I mean, religion does play a role in Saudi politics, an important one, but it does so in the US as well, in many different parts of the world. There are people in the US that teach creationism and promote all sorts of other things, as we know, and combat abortion in the name of religion. So I'm not saying that the Saudi state is a secular state that is being driven by religious forces elsewhere. I mean, of course, by definition, it identifies with religion. However, a dynastic element is the paramount one in terms of the logic of rule. Now, why did I go into this long detour in reference to your question? It's because we have to track the rise and fall of the dynastic dynamic for us to be able to understand the politics of the 1950s or any other era in this space. So first we had the first Saudi kingdom. Muhammad Ali destroys it by invading from Egypt. This was an Ottoman counterinsurgency campaign in a way that went there. And then you had another Saudi state appearing, in the 19th century. And then you had a revival of the third Saudi state. And the figure that played the key role in that is this very shrewd and powerful ruler whose name was King Abdel Aziz. So Abdel Aziz is responsible for creating the modern version of the Saudi state. And all the rulers that have led the Saudi state since his death have been his sons, essentially, to this very day. There will be a transition very soon once King Salman dies, but Salman is Abdel Aziz's son. So, his grandson, MBS, will take power after his father dies. So that's quite remarkable, actually, if you think about it, that for more than 100 years now, this place has been pretty much ruled by one guy and his sons.
So what sort of state had Abdulaziz built? Where did he leave the kingdom when he died? They had conquered so much of the peninsula through this military religious juggernaut that we've discussed in so much detail. Oil revenue was starting to come in, but was there really much of a state?
In terms of what happens after he passes away, he was such a powerful figure that you're bound to get into the question of succession and rule and the form of rule that will take place after the death of such a figure. It was bound to generate some gap. And you have, of course, naturally, you have an older brother in the picture, who is King Saud, who most historians, I think, would tell you was not the strongest character that could have succeeded somebody like King Abdulaziz. And he succeeded him at a time when, the oil revenues were beginning to be generated, but the state had not yet been created. It was a state building phase. You had still a very basic form of rule. And by basic, I'm not using it, to suggest any civilizational supremacy or any sense of hierarchy and development in this world. But by basic, what I mean is that you have major income flowing in, and you still don't have a structure for a government. Now, Abdulaziz, towards the end of his rule, was trying to think for a solution for that. And, that's why he was starting to think about a council of ministers that would run affairs of the state. At this stage yet, up till his death, you did not have the basic bureaucracies that you would think about, or the basic political process that you would normally expect in a state like this. So you definitely had the ruler, you had their advisors, but you did not have very well organized ministries or a clear division of how the political process is run. And that created problems. So for much of the 50s, there was the attempt to figure out a way around that. The creation of state organs, of ministries, of basic structures. There were some structures that were more advanced than others, especially those that were inherited from the Hashemite administration in Hijaz, which was conquered, of course, by the Saudi state. So, for example, you had a Ministry of Foreign Affairs that could rely on some, professional expert cadres that and had a process affiliated with it. You had, of course, the most important ministry was the oil ministry. And in this case, there was a fascinating figure, Abdullah Tariqi, who was leading it. And I know we'll talk about him later, I'm sure. And you had different bodies that were associated with key, central organs of the state. But everything else had to go through the ruler himself. So if the ruler was not very effective and efficient and organized, which Saud was not of that sort, then you could run into problems. Now, another set of issues is more structural. This is the bureaucratic side. But the bureaucratic side is not negligible, because often in arrangements like this, where you have a very large ruling family, you need to have a way for allocating different pieces of the pie in a manner that will not allow for conflict between the brothers in the family. And this becomes the main logic of Saudi rule, how to manage these fraternal relations in an effective manner.
Yeah, let's get into that in some more detail, because what is kind of shocking here is that there's this conflict, including so many radical currents amongst elites within the royal family. And ultimately, and we'll get to this at the end of the interview, King Saud's conservative brother, Prince Faisal, ousts him in 1964, which turns the kingdom decidedly rightward. But for now, lay out the basic politics and power plays that are running through and also just structuring the Saudi royal family throughout the 50s and 60s. Who is King Saud? What explains his openness to nationalism and reform? Who is Faisal, and what made him such a reactionary power? And then third, who are the free princes? And then lastly, how did all of these various royal forces contend for power? How did these palace conflicts that took up so many of the conflicting answers to the big questions of 20th century Arab politics, how did they take shape at the very heights of Saudi royal power?
Yeah, I mean, these are excellent questions, and they're not easy questions to answer without, again, some background knowledge about how this family functions. What you have is a very, very large family, and it's centered around the Abdel Aziz line. The minute Abdel Aziz dies, you have a second son, Saud, taking charge. Now, what's the problem here with Saud? The problem with Saud was that, I mean, everybody knew that he was going to be the next king, okay? Since the death of his older brother, Turkey, in 1919, it became clear that he was going to be the next king. You know, his dad gave him some important posts previously. He was ruling basically Najd on behalf of his father, which is basically the main region that Saud comes from. He played a role in some of the initial reforms that Abdel Aziz was envisioning when I was telling you he was beginning to start to think about state building after the oil revenues started coming. And of course, the first clear direction that Abdel Aziz was heading in was relating to finances. Since there is now a major source of income coming, and of course, before oil, you did have some sources of income, like the Hajj brings income in Saudi Arabia. There are other sources of income. But, especially after oil, there needed to be some major reforms to the way those things were done. So Saud emerges as somebody who's engaged in the financial side of things, which is quite ironic because one of the biggest aspects of his legacy later on as a king is that he messes up the finances. Okay, so he helps establish the Saudi central bank. He's involved in these different discussions about how to prepare the state's first budget. There's major things that Saud is involved in initially. Okay, but what happens after he becomes king? Initially, there are some good indications happening early on. Not many people will expect this, but one of Saud's earliest acts was to announce a 5-year plan. And, you would associate this with Soviet history, not with Saudi history. But of course, in Saudi Arabia, there were 5-year plans, and Saud started that. So he had this orientation that was developmental. At least he announced such an orientation. Okay, he set up different types of companies. He started initiating some improvements to the Hajj process. There were a bunch of things that he was taking that would be identifiable with the developmental kind of agenda. And of course, what's strange about Saudi Arabia here is that you did not need the same kind of strong pairing between an independence struggle and a developmental agenda, because what you had was a country that had never been formally colonized, even though, by the way, it was within the sphere of intervention of Western powers for a long time, including even now. So when somebody like him could come and announce this agenda, it did not require him positing it against a dark colonial past or against, it was just like, okay, now we're going to announce these 5-year plans and we're going to start these reforms. However, what is also interesting is Saud does not want to be associated with forces in the region that are tied to the colonialists in a direct way. And in particular, we're here talking about the British colonials. So many people find it weird. Why was there an alliance between Saud and Abdel Nasser? They both come to power roughly around the same time. And they actually established a very nice working arrangement initially.
They worked together against the Baghdad Pact, for example.
They worked together against the Baghdad Pact, absolutely.
And they're generally allied. Well, we later think of Nasser's Egypt and Saudi Arabia as sort of the implacable foes on two different sides of what's often, I know you don't like the term, but what's often called the Arab Cold War. But listeners to this series will recall that the earlier interstate system had a set of alliances that put Saudi Arabia and Egypt on one side against the Hashemite kingdoms on the other.
That's absolutely correct, Daniel. And this is the main issue that I want our listeners to think about structurally when they want to think about these alliances. Because the main worry for the Saudis was not Egypt. It was the Hashemites. The Hashemites were their historic foes. The Saudis were the rulers of Najd. The Hashemites were the rulers of the Hijaz. Najd and the Hijaz are the two most important regions of Saudi Arabia historically. Of course, later on with the discovery of oil in the eastern province, which is the area around Al-Hassa, and the Mam and Khobar, this region, the eastern province, these are all areas in it. The discovery of oil there makes it very important. But when you look at the big political centers of power, Hijaz and Najd were the two big ones, and the Hashemites were the rulers of Hijaz until the Saudis oust essentially Sharif Hussein and his sons from their position of prominence.
And the Sharif is promised by the British a unified Arab monarchy under his control. And instead, not only do the former Arab Ottoman lands get broken up under the British and French colonial mandate system, they lose their home base on the Arabian Peninsula, where Mecca and Medina and Jeddah are, to the expanding Saudi state that's expanding with critical British support.
Absolutely. This is a big deal. The British do not play a very positive role from a Hashemite perspective around that. They're seen as betraying their old ally. And remember that the unified kingdom that the Sharif was promised included way more than the Arabian Peninsula. It included all the Ottoman Arab territories, the former Arab Ottoman territories. So they would have included Iraq and Syria and Jordan and Lebanon and Palestine. And of course, later on, the British start reinterpreting their promises to say, well, Palestine's excluded, parts of Lebanon are excluded there. But in reality, now actually, Peter Shamrock has proven in a recent book, excellent recent book, that this is total rubbish. Basically, that all of that was clear in the agreement. In any case, that actually initiates a dynamic of historic rivalry between the Al Saud and the Hashemites. And of course, another royal family, which is the descendants of Muhammad Ali in Egypt, they enter with the Al Saud in this alliance. Even though, weirdly, by the way, of course, the Muhammad Ali was responsible for destroying the first Saudi Strait. So their ancestor played a negative role against the Saudis, but nevertheless, politics, changes everybody, and people will develop new alliances depending on the moment.
No permanent friends, no permanent enemies, as people say.
That is correct. That is correct. So what you end up having is a Hashemite containment plan, essentially, as far as the Saudis are concerned. Now, the Hashemites themselves, of course, were very worried about the Saudis because the logic of the Saudis was expansion. This was a power that thrived on expansion and continued to be expanding well into the 1920s. It expanded into Yemen. It expanded into the Gulf. It expanded into the northern part of the Arabian Peninsula and was pushing towards Jordan and Iraq. And the forces of expansion were, of course, the religious forces in the kingdom that were closely allied with the Al Saud family. Eventually, the Saudis stop expanding. They strike a deal with the British. They're like, look, we're not going to take more of Jordan or of Iraq. We'll respect those boundaries. But things are still tricky with the Hashemites after that. There's still no trust. And the Saudis also make a major change structurally by essentially striking their oil deals with the Americans. So King Abdel Aziz does a move that was very bold by regional standards at the time. And he's like, I'm not going with the British, I'm going with the Americans. And of course, the British are not too happy about it. But it does bring in a new player into the region. The Saudis essentially bring in the Americans big time into the region for the first time at that level. Because this was a British-dominated region from the First World War, end of the First World War onwards. And in the case of the southeastern part of the Arabian Peninsula, actually the whole eastern flank of it, the Gulf Coast, that was under British control for the most part. So the Saudis really introduce a new variant, and that adds to the complexity of their structural contradiction with the Hashemites. In any case, these contradictions are not helped by the 1948 war. In fact, the war for Palestine augments whatever distrust that existed before of the Hashemites. There are many other problems that take place in that context between the Saudis and the Hashemites. And what this means is the Egyptians have an interest in maintaining a good strategic relationship with them. And this interest is seen in multiple arenas. It's seen in files that you would not expect. For example, you have a situation where King Saud rejects joining the Baghdad Pact. That's a very interesting move. Saudi Arabia joining the Baghdad Pact would have been very beneficial for it. But he decides, look, I'm not going to join that. I'm not going to strengthen and enhance Iraq's power. The other thing that happens is that the Saudis send signals in major moments, like during the tripartite aggression. That was one of the major moments that they had of fraternity with Egypt, where King Saud stops exporting oil to Britain and France. So there's a good, healthy dynamic initially starting. Over the Oman question, Egypt and Saudi are cooperating. They both back the imamate during the Jabal Akhdar revolution in Oman, and they really initially worked together to undermine the British-backed Sultan's attempt to destroy the imamate and take over the interior part of Oman, which was under its control. So the Saudis are doing a lot at this stage. By the way, in the UN, they're supporting Algeria. And in the UN, one interesting fact, Daniel, you know who's their representative in the UN?
No.
You'll find it curious. It's Ahmed al-Shuqairi, who is the founder of the Palestine Liberation Organization. He's a Palestinian figure. At this stage, he's representing them. He's making big speeches for anti-colonial liberation in Algeria, and especially in the Maghreb region. The Saudis are totally okay with this kind of agenda at this stage. Clashing with the old imperial powers is not a problem for them. And that was the main focus for Nasser, and the most important thing for him at this stage is to get the British and the French out.
So let's get back to that question of succession and of the transfer of power from Abdul Aziz, and where that leaves Saud, Faisal, and also Talal, the so-called Red Prince, who would later found the Free Princes. What accounts for these various bases of power, the rival visions for politics, and the balance of power between those forces?
So what we have is a set of family dynamics that are based on, first of all, King Abdul Aziz's many marriages. and you had different sons from different wives as a result. And we're talking about dozens of kids here. Okay, each one of them is a prince. Each one of them is a potential contender for the throne at some point. Now, of course, there is an A-list in this scene, and the A-list will be determined by multiple factors that include who's a person's mother, but also how skilled they are, what's the strength of their personality. But there are many factors that go into how this works. So when somebody like King Saud, he's the son of a woman called Wadha bint Muhammad al-Urir. And al-Urir are a very prominent family. They were some of the sheikhs of the Bani Khalid tribe, which ruled the eastern part of the kingdom for a long time. And they used to be actually competitors with the Al Saud. So the fact that he comes from a certain lineage like that is helpful for him. The fact that he is the eldest son after his older brother dies at an early age helps him. Okay, it puts him in a powerful position vis-a-vis his brothers. But there are other brothers out there that don't necessarily have from their mother's side a strong tribal background, but might have been liked at an early stage by King Abdel Aziz, might have been favored, might have been picked by him as people who could be potentially interesting. So one of them, for example, is Prince Talal, who founds the Free Princes movement. His mother is actually Armenian. She's not from a powerful tribe in the kingdom or anything like that, but he was one of the younger also sons of Abdel Aziz, relatively speaking. But his dad, for some reason, liked him and put him in some important and significant posts. He saw some potential. These dynamics mattered. Who Abdel Aziz thought of highly, who did he place in a strong position, and the character that was perhaps the strongest in terms of both where it came from, but also how it saw things and how it dealt with the world, was this fascinating guy called Faisal bin Abdel Aziz. Faisal was an older character. Is one of the he's not the oldest son, but he's one of the older ones. He was born in 1906. He has a very strong personality, and he held important military positions in the past. He comes from his mother's side, from the top branches of the Saudi kind of hierarchy, lineage hierarchy. His mother is from the Al Sheikh family, which is basically is essentially from his maternal line is descended from Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, the preacher, and from his paternal line is descended from the ruler. Is the son of Abdul Aziz, the ruler, and of course who traces his way his lineage way back to the first Saudi state. So he has both the royal and the theological kind of authority combined in that way. So under this situation, okay, you have somebody like Saud who's making clear gestures at what nowadays we would call modernization or the economic development, but really it's a bumpy ride under him, and his style of rule is a very, very haphazard one. He was known, by the way, the myth is he couldn't say no. Anybody that asked for money, they would come to his court and he would say yes. There was major overspending, there was major corruption, there was the state was not very efficiently run that way, especially from the financial side. Now that meant that you had these reformist figures like Talal, who had managed to assemble around him some of the younger and kind of more open-minded princes. And some of them, were close to him by virtue of lineage, again, maternal lineage. So, for example, Prince Nawaf was a close associate of Prince Talal. He's his full brother. He participates with him in the Free Princes movement. His mother is Munayir, who, as we mentioned, was an Armenian woman. Incidentally, by the way, she's an Armenian genocide survivor. There's an interesting background there. He's much younger. These people are much younger than the older sons. King Abdel Aziz's, older sons, like I mentioned, like people like Faisal, were born very early on. We're talking 1906. They're born in the early 20th century. Whereas these guys are a product of the late 20s, early 30s. There's a good 20 plus year gap between them. They're the age of some of the sons of these princes, of the older princes. So you have this dynamic going on as well, that is also generational. In any case, you do find that there is this generational situation where some of the young princes are coalescing around ideas of reform. They're influenced very much by the figure of Jamal Abdel Nasser. So as the 1950s proceed, especially after the tripartite aggression fails in 56, and after Sawt al-Arab had become such a potent force in Arab media, you have this attraction to Nasserism, the figure of Nasser as a very powerful figure who was leading the pathway for development, for national reconstruction, for creating modernity in the region, establishing Arab unity. All of this is very attractive for these young men that Prince Talal gathers around him at the time. And really, when you think of it, they were very young men. I mean, Talal was born 1931. By the time he's doing the Free Princes, he is 27 years old. And the others are younger than him even. So you have the situation. What do they want? They're asking for closer relations with Egypt. They're asking for political reform. They're asking for a constitution. They're saying we can't have a state without a constitution. Some of them are even presenting themselves as people who will eventually lead to the creation of a constitutional parliamentary monarchy. And they're suggesting first steps. Like Talal proposes this idea of, why don't we have a national council? This was actually one of the earliest ideas that really trigger fears from the more conservative wing of the family. The older brothers, the better experienced ones, the ones that come from the core of the family, like Prince Faisal. Prince Faisal is like, what are these people on? Are they out there to destroy the family? He sees them as romantics who are attracted to an agenda that is not realistically suitable for Saudi Arabia, or the perpetuation of the rule of the family, which is the number one priority of somebody like Faisal. Now, I should note also that Faisal's military credentials should not be discounted here. Again, this is somebody who led campaigns of conquest on horseback and camelback. You know what I mean? This is not, he was very involved with his dad in the early years in what the Saudis would refer to as the expansionist conquest phase of the kingdom. So there's a huge gulf between those forces and this Free Princes movement that's coming and raising big reform slogans that are deemed to be completely unrealistic by the likes of Faisal. Mind you, Faisal, however, was very concerned about the economic aspect. He saw himself as a reformer, but what he considered to be reform was very different from what they considered to be reform. He wanted economic reform without political reform, whereas they wanted both.
And what was King Saud's stance in response to that, with his reactionary brother, Prince Faisal, to his right and the crown princes to his left?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to call Faisal completely reactionary in that way. Politically, he definitely was. But when it comes to the economic side, maybe he had a more developed vision than Saud's for sure. But again, yes, of course, if you forget about these relative dimensions, in overall terms, yes, King Faisal was a reactionary for sure. Okay, in the sense that the number one objective was to perpetuate the clan and to perpetuate the dynasty and to ensure the preservation of its rule. King Saud would have come from a similar background, except the problem that he faced was that he did not know what to do. Now that he has a very powerful challenger on the one side, criticizing him for economic mismanagement and for failure at creating efficient state structures, and then on the other hand, he has these three princes that he has to deal with. So in a way, sometimes he has to rely on those three princes, ironically, as he confronts this, I'm sorry to say this, much more serious challenge from the right. And this is one thing that I should emphasize. My reading is that Faisal was always in a stronger position than the three princes. You know, I know we get excited about, there's this very big trend and there's these young princes and coalescing and they're making lots of noise. But if you look at the balance of power, if you look at who's been around long enough, who has prestige within the family, who has the ability to create a very powerful position around them, it's Faisal. Now, of course, there are things going for the three princes. Egyptian support is one important element. But even the Egyptians, they don't help that movement much later on, because after they start increasing the temperature with the Saudis, as their clash with the conservative forces in Saudi Arabia expands and increases, they end up harming the prospects of the forces that are most enamored with them locally, which were the Free Princes.
Organized oil workers play an important role in Saudi Arabia, also in Iraq, also a little bit outside the scope of this series, in Iran, really across the region. But before we get to oil workers, I want to return to the place of oil more generally, and the oil giant Aramco in particular in Saudi Arabia. What role did Aramco, with all the ties to the U.S. involved, what role did it play in structuring Saudi Arabia domestically in both political and economic terms, and in Saudi Arabia's place within the region and the world? Because Aramco was, on the one hand, this giant American force in the country, but on the other hand, its role within the country was highly contested at this time. With Abdel Takriti, who you mentioned earlier, he served as the Saudi petroleum minister and co-founded OPEC alongside Venezuela's Juan Pablo Perez Alfonso, and he was known as the Red Sheik for his politics and his ties to radical circles, and was playing this huge role not only within Saudi Arabia, but within OPEC's attempt to remake the entire global oil market, and in a sense, at its most radical edges, to decolonize the entire capitalist world system. So what was going on with oil and with Aramco in 1950s Saudi Arabia?
There are so many elements to this, Daniel. And one element that we cannot avoid, basically, when we're thinking about Saudi Arabia, is that Aramco is the source of main income. So that's one element that's very important. Aramco is also the source of new technology. It's the source of planning. It's the first actually well-oiled, and no pun intended, bureaucratic machine that comes into the country. And it's massive. It's massive. It's employing so many people. It has multiple divisions. Some of them are so-called development divisions. Some of them are prospecting divisions, drilling divisions. It's a huge structure. Overall, Aramco is the most powerful body in Saudi Arabia in the 1950s. But it's the structure that is functioning on Saudi soil that is key for the Saudi state, that the Saudi state depends on. There's a relationship of dependency. And of course, it's codependency because, Aramco officials do not want to alienate the Saudi state either. But essentially, the relationship has major strains on it because this is an era of nationalization. Venezuela really starts the process. You have people like Mossadegh in 1953 attempting, a follow-up to the process. Later on, of course, in Iraq. So we have a situation where there are pressures globally on the oil industry. And there are figures like this economic visionary Saudi figure, Abdel Takriti, who's coming in and essentially is trying to figure out a way to maximize resource independence for his country, but also make it a force for good and for radical transformation across the region as a whole. So he's not somebody who's very narrowly focused just on Saudi Arabia. He's somebody who has a pan-Arabist vision.
And really a third worldist vision. OPEC extends all the way to Venezuela and ultimately Nigeria, Indonesia.
Yes, and that's but we should note that this third worldist that by 1955 pan-Arabism is thoroughly third worldist. It plays a big role in Bandung. It is a core component of this thinking, and even before that, I mean, it's an anti-colonial way of looking at the world. It is not a narrow nationalism that way. So we have this situation where really an interesting alliance emerging between a modernizing figure like Abdel Takriti and the people who are trying to advocate for reform within the family. So the Red Princes come into alliance with this Red Sheikh in many ways. Now, the co-founding of OPEC was really one of the major achievements of this exceptional oil minister. Really, when you look at the background of people like him, they got exposed to political currents fairly early on through travel. Abdullah was educated in Kuwait and then in Cairo. He spent a long time in Egypt. Okay, and he was one of the earliest Saudi graduates. Later on, by the way, and this is something that is very interesting, he went to Texas, which is, of course, where I teach, to receive his master's degree in petroleum engineering. So this is somebody who has had this technocratic training, but at the same time went to parts of the Arab world that were undergoing major independence struggles, especially Egypt, at important moments in their histories, the 1940s. And by the time he comes back to Saudi Arabia, he comes back at the year of the Nakba. And he's looking at what's going on in Saudi Arabia from a broader regional and international perspective that he had gained through his many travels and through being so involved in so many different parts of the world. Now, one interesting thing about Abdullah is that he comes back to his homeland at what we now would consider to be a young age, but it's not the young by those years' standards. He came back at the age of 29. And he's coming back armed with this high-level education. And this is somebody who starts to be absorbed into the bureaucracies that were being set up by the Saudi state at this stage. So he's benefiting from this new process that's just emerging. But also, The state is desperate for him because there aren't enough people with university degrees. There aren't enough people with high school degrees, let alone university degrees at this stage.
Which is one reason why someone with such relatively radical politics has such surprising leverage with the Saudi state. He has skills they need.
Right. And this is also why you can get like a 31-year-old being appointed the Director General of Petroleum and Mineral Affairs in the Ministry of Finance. That's like a huge deal, you know? So he rises up the ranks very quickly, and he's bringing with him these radical views. Now, I'm sure that he was, first of all, at this stage, he was not as radical as he was going to become, but he had a dose of it. And I'm sure that he did not go around parading his credentials, his radical credentials, still in Saudi Arabia at the time. But definitely, ideas of reform were something that people talked about. They were looking around. The country had deep poverty, but the country had this enormous opportunity, the opportunity of having this incredible resource. What was going to be done with it was a very big question. Takriti had one option, one vision for that. He wanted it to be a transformative tool, locally, regionally, and internationally. So the interesting position that he was in also meant that he had to kind of explain what the company was doing to the family. And remember, this is not an easy thing to understand. What the company is doing means that it's producing a lot of facts and figures, and it's presenting like finances that are very complicated. So you could say that for a while he works essentially as a translator in some ways for these princes, but also is informing them and educating them about the financial side that was definitely in the company's favor. So that also helps, his exposure to what's going on behind the scenes at such great detail allows him to think of a more radical trajectory. Now, eventually, 6 years later, and he plays a key role in this, of course, a Ministry of Petroleum and Mineral Resources was created. This was in 1960. And by the way, this is an indication of the problem that I was telling you earlier about the lack of bureaucracies being one of the big challenges. That it's still a state in formation. In a state that's so dependent on oil, to not have a ministry until 1960 is quite amazing. But he certainly sees that as a problem. He's like, we can't keep on running this through the Ministry of Finance. We need to make it a more high-level, endeavor, and we need to take it to the next level. And that's when he helps create that ministry and becomes the first minister, of course.
How did Saudi oil workers get organized, and what sort of power did they wield? And then what was the impact of that worker organization and the strikes that those organized workers carried out on the broader Saudi working class, and also more generally on Saudi politics?
So I always focus on the role of oil as a potential proletarianizing force, because the oil industry, it's an industry. It requires workers, it requires industrial sites, it requires a concentration of working class people in space and time. And it's a very highly exploitative structure where the means of production are concentrated in the hands of these multinational corporations that are very closely tied to the imperial powers of the day. So all of this was in operation in Saudi Arabia, and what it meant was that it transformed a local society that did not have major industries of that kind before, that utilized this modern machinery, that utilized this capital intensive investment. And of course, part of Aramco's stated mission initially was somehow, quote unquote, development, which meant that it would, promise also to hire people from the local area and so on. It promised that it would bring something good. Now, as we know from history, that's not how things worked, at least for the workers that initially joined Aramco. It might have brought great wealth overall, but it also took a lot of wealth from the country, and it definitely exploited a lot of people.
And the actual situation on the ground in terms of management and labor was extraordinarily racialized and colonial.
Yes. So as a company that was essentially run by Americans, and Americans who carried deeply racist ideas and were reproducing them, we have a situation where they're bringing in the racial hierarchies from the U.S., implementing them on the ground. There's now a big literature on this in the field. There's another thing that's going on, of course, which is the working conditions are so hard. I mean, you have people living in these barracks that are unbearable in the summer. This is a hot place. If you create these barracks with these steel, structures, it's very hot. It's really cruel, actually. And you had all these local workers pushed into these structures. You had a situation where there was better food for the American staff, of course, and for the management and so on. You had better food for the white people. You had better facilities. You had wonderful facilities for the managerial staff, of course. And essentially, by the way, what Aramco does, and to this very day, it's a unique phenomena. It's essentially an American suburb planted into Saudi Arabia's eastern region. So it's created its own subculture, almost. And I know a lot of so-called Aramco kids. They'll tell you it is its own weird world, basically, where the culture is essentially American, even though it attracts people from across the world, and there's a lot of people from the Middle East that are concentrated there. But the actual setting is in Saudi Arabia. And Aramco proper, the American suburb, is a very nice place. But then you have these workers living in facilities that are very different than those given for management and for the expats. Now, interestingly, it's one of these expats who's a Palestinian communist who comes in and brings in the idea of organizing a strike. And we know this now from the memoirs of one of the strike leaders of 1953, Al-Awami. But, I want us to be very clear. This is not some external agitator theory type of thing where these ideas are coming in from abroad. There's no base for them. Just because you have exchange of ideas does not mean that there's no local basis for them. Palestinians themselves did not invent the idea of a strike. They got it from elsewhere. They did not invent the idea of boycott. That got started in Ireland, for example. But it gets adopted and it's used by people for their own uses. So, and I'm saying this because many people, especially amongst ruling circles, but also imperialist circles, they try to undermine the authenticity of Saudi labor movements, particularly, and Gulf labor movements in general, by claiming that whatever that took place was the work of external agitators. Now, that does not mean that there was no transnational organizing or that transnational ideas did not play a role. So you had, as I mentioned, there's this Palestinian side to the story. There was also some influence from Bahraini workers who had radicalized a bit earlier in Babco, the Bahrain oil company that had witnessed a very strong labor movement. For anybody who knows the map, Bahrain and Saudi Arabia are so close, like the eastern region where the oil is very close to Bahrain. So there's a lot of intermixing. But this whole region at this stage is absorbing so many people from so many different places. And that's what oil companies do. That's what Aramco's effect is. It's actually concentrating labor in one place. But it's also allowing for cross-fertilization of ideas in one place, precisely because it's recruiting so many different people from so many different countries, carrying all these different experiences. Now, eventually the situation gets so unbearable that you have these major strikes that take place. But Daniel, let me tell you, the violence with which people were faced during these strikes is unbelievable. It was often dealt with as a military threat almost. Places like Saudi Arabia saw them as a threat to the integrity of the state and the regime and the future of the regime. They did not want this to expand. There was, of course, also a sectarian dimension to this. This was in a region that had a large Shia population. I should warn, by the way, nowadays there's a literature that tries to overemphasize the sectarian dimension, despite the fact that it was clearly class that played the biggest role in the Aramco strikes.
This is a common theme in this series.
Yes, it's a very common theme in this series. Unfortunately, after the Iranian Revolution and definitely after the Iraq War, there is this attraction of sectarianizing everything, and it would be a mistake to consider that the eastern part of Saudi Arabia does not have a sectarian dynamic. I mean, of course, there was sectarian oppression even. The followers of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab saw Shiism as an anathema to their theology. But as I mentioned earlier in this episode, Al Saud's primary logic was regime survival and perpetuation and expansion. So if that meant sometimes not going too zealous on enforcing the religious ideology on those that belong to different sects, then they might engage in that. Sometimes they're going to crack down if they feel that their power is threatened. So it really depends. But in any case, there was definitely a situation there where you had, of course, some major resentment. I mean, the regime was not popular in that part of the country for obvious reasons. Al Saud did not come from there. They had conquered the place. They belonged to predominantly to a different religious sect. However, the reality was that they intermittently ruled that place for a long time. And they had also some local base of support as well. So it was a complicated relationship. And eventually, when it came to dealing with labor problems, you had these local alliances get activated, traditional structures get activated to contain the situation. Sometimes to the benefit of workers. You know, sometimes the fact that you come from a place, you have a tribal background or so on, it might help eventually get you out of jail, potentially. It might help, these kinship networks do play a role. But also at the same time, they can play a role at suppressing movements like this through activating structures that allow the government to have greater access into society and therefore greater control over it.
Sketch out the broader dissident political scene, including organized oil workers, but also beyond them. What role did various nationalist or radical groups play, and what role did Hijazi or other sorts of regionalist anti-Saudi sentiments that rejected the borders of the modern Saudi state established through the conquest we've been discussing, to what extent did they play a role in Saudi politics, dissident politics in the 50s and 60s?
You have a communist movement beginning to emerge, and eventually, you have a communist party being officially declared in Saudi Arabia in the mid-70s. There's different cells that are operating in that orbit. There's definitely Nasserist figures. You might say that there's no formal party around this current, but it's a very big current because of the reach of Nasser's stations, because of the strength of his perceived achievements, especially anti-colonial battles. And then you have also the presence of movements that are operating in the region like the Ba'ath. They're establishing cells in Saudi Arabia. They're attracting some Saudi Arabian dissidents. You have also movements that are affiliated with the movement of Arab nationalists. And all of these different movements operate in Saudi Arabia at different levels of strength during this period. I should note, however, that we should never forget the right has a very strong movement of its own. So, the Muslim Brotherhood, after it's exiled from Nasser by Nasser from Egypt. Many of its leaders, after his crackdown, many of his leaders go into exile into Saudi Arabia, and Faisal plays a big role in hosting them. So that's a whole different dimension from the other side.
Even though the Muslim Brotherhood's brand of Islamist conservatism is not Wahhabist.
It is not, but there's this weird cross-fertilization that happens. And actually, many of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood figures that come to Saudi Arabia play a big role in Faisal's project of exporting regional conservatism and religiosity as part of his clash with Nasser, essentially, throughout the 1960s. And later on, some of their students and some of the after effects of that play a role in the Afghani side of the story. So, they establish, they staff universities, they become the professors that are teaching these different kind of subjects. There is a big literature on this. Unfortunately, some of it is a sketchy literature. There are serious studies, but there's also the sketchy counterterrorism literature that sometimes misreads what's going on. But definitely, this is an important phenomenon. So we have the full spectrum of regional movements represented in Saudi Arabia at this stage, partly as a byproduct of migration from other parts of the region, but also as a byproduct of Saudis encountering ideas in these other parts of the region, and Saudis locally searching for solutions to their huge dilemmas. This is not a small Gulf state. This is a country that is huge. It is incredibly diverse. It has a relatively large population. So, and it had big challenges.
We've talked about Kuwait a lot already, but we should just pause to briefly touch on it again here. You write, quote, Kuwait was the most economically and politically dynamic territory in the Gulf region in the 1950s. We've already discussed why this was the case, including how it made room for a powerful movement of Arab nationalists in Kuwait. But for our purposes here, briefly remind listeners what sort of impact Kuwait's political dynamism had for politics across the Arabian Peninsula during this period.
So, unlike Saudi Arabia, where there's still no constitution, for example, Kuwait adopts a constitution early on. And that's as a result of the pressures from the movement of Arab nationalists, but also as a result of the openness of the emir at the time, Abdullah Salim, who was the emir that oversaw the independence process from Britain. By the way, incidentally, now there's been a rebellion against these reforms. Parliament was suspended.
Just in the last month.
Correct. So over the past few weeks, we've seen major changes happen in Kuwait. And just now there's been the appointment of a new crown prince there that does not come actually from the major two wings of the family that traditionally supplied the rulers of Kuwait. So there's interesting stuff happening there on the constitutional and political front now. But what's interesting in Kuwait is that there's a parliament, there's a constitution.
There's an independent merchant class.
Yes, there's an independent merchant class. I mean, it's gradually losing its independence. Traditionally, the merchant class had a counterbalancing effect on the ruling family. And many Kuwaiti scholars sometimes describe this as Kuwait is a byproduct of almost a social contract, if you will, between the merchants and the ruling family. It was literally founded as a merchant city, essentially, near Basra, that could benefit merchants. So, and historically, the merchants used to, of course, even play a very big role in the finances. They used to even lend the government in many different cases. But as oil gets discovered, their position gets weaker because the ruling family becomes stronger. Remember, Britain gives the ruling families control over oil resources, which is what happens also in Saudi Arabia. It's ultimately the king that has control over the as final say over the resources of the country. So, what this means for Kuwait's role as a radical revolutionary hub is that because of this relative openness press laws that allowed for publications to appear. Even some publications that were underground would still appear without too much repression. You had discussions in the open happening in Kuwait in ways that were not taking place elsewhere. There was an atmosphere of radicalism as a result of the fact that the movement of Arab nationalists was the primary force locally, but also you had a very large Palestinian community there. At some point, you have 400,000 Palestinians in Kuwait, almost the same number as Kuwaitis. And this brings with it a very rich political life as well. So you have all the Palestinian factions represented, which means every political current in the world represented, because the Palestinian factions reflected all the currents you can imagine, from Maoism to Stalinism to liberals. There are, it's a big world. And of course, there's a right wing as well. So there's a whole world existing out there in Kuwait. And then you have workers' communities, Yemeni workers. You have Dhofari workers. You have all these communities, very working class. They're bringing with them their experiences of oppression in their different countries. And they're also looking at this model that's unfolding in Kuwait and contrasting it with where they're coming from. And they're asking questions like, why don't I have well-paved street like the one that's existing here? Why don't I have a school? Why don't I have also political rights like the ones existing here? Why isn't there a parliament? These kind of experiences matter, and they play a big role in creating radical consciousness out of Kuwait. One thing I should note to listeners, and we're going to see this very soon when we go back to Palestine, many of the most important Palestinian movements were born in Kuwait, including Fatah. Even Hamas, many of its prominent leaders today were born in Kuwait, Khalid Mish'al, others. Okay, this is a very important place for the political development of Palestinian movement. Same applies to the South Yemeni revolution. Many of its major leaders came from Kuwait. Saudi opposition, a lot of people from the Saudi opposition, including Abdel Takriti that we spoke about, he had studied in Kuwait. And so this is a very important place for the region. And this is not to mention artists and thinkers. The Iraqi poet, the greatest Iraqi poet, arguably, of possibly one of the best Arab poets of the 20th century, Abdel Razzaq Takriti, he spent his exile in Kuwait. Salma Khadraja Yusi, the famous Palestinian anthologist, she was in Kuwait. All of these figures, Ghassan Kanafani. So this is a big hub, and ideas get produced there, and they get also distributed from there.
Definitely, and we'll be getting into how these diasporas in Kuwait, including very much from across South Arabia, intersect with the movement of Arab nationalists, which is such a powerhouse in Kuwait, and how that then leads to the NLF taking power in South Yemen and the major armed struggle, Dhofari armed struggle, waged in Oman.
I'm Naomi Klein, and you're listening to The Dig, my go-to podcast for the most thoughtful, in-depth conversation on the left. It's an incredible place to be exposed to new ideas and new writing. And if you can, please become a sustaining supporter at Patreon.
This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by Haymarket Books, which has loads of great left-wing titles, perfect for Dig listeners like you. One that you might like is Twilight Prisoners, The Rise of the Hindu Right and the Fall of India by Siddhartha Deb. Traveling across India, interviewing Hindu zealots, armed insurgents, jailed dissidents, and politicians and thinkers from across the political spectrum, Siddhartha Deb reveals a country in which forces old and new have aligned to endanger democracy. The result is an absorbing, incisive, deeply reported, and lyrical account of India's descent into authoritarianism. As Nikhil Saval puts it, as a book about India, and simply as a book about contemporary global politics, Twilight Prisoners is in a class of its own, going deeper than anyone else dares into the history of India's crimes against its people. Find Twilight Prisoners by Siddhartha Deb at haymarketbooks.org, where all paperback books are 20% off, every day. Qatar and Bahrain also saw mass Nasserist and anti-nationalist, anti-imperialist protests during this period. What sort of monarchical regimes had consolidated in these countries? And then how did the tidal wave of Arab radicalism that washed across the region in the 50s and 60s express itself in response?
Well, one thing to remember, Daniel, is it's not just about the regimes in this case, it's also about the fact that the British are still in the region. So in the case of Bahrain and Qatar, they're both under British protection at this stage, which means that they're under British control, really, when it comes to questions of foreign policy, when it comes to questions of security. Essentially, there's a form of what I've called elsewhere in my writings, imperial sovereignty existing across the region at this stage. So the popular movements had a dual character. They were opposing unchecked monarchical rule, and monarchical, by the way, should be taken with a bit of flexibility, because what you have here is not your typical royal family. What you have is princely states operating in different formations. So typically they're ruled by a sheikh or a prince, an emir, that is under British control. That's certainly the case in Bahrain, which also, by the way, was the headquarters of the main British political operation in the region, what they called their political residency there. So in Bahrain, you had a very early development of radical movements. This was the place where oil was first struck in the region. It was a place that had a vibrant mercantile history in the past. It had also a vibrant history of labor mobilization in sectors that predated even oil. So I've just served on a committee for a fantastic dissertation that was written by Bandar Said, and he discusses how pearling workers had actually launched major mobilizations against the British and their ruling family. And this was early 1930s. So you have this history that is very layered in Bahrain. And what happens there is that in the 1950s, you have the development of a major national coalition called Hay'at al-Ittihad al-Watani that basically brought together, it's a national union committee essentially, that brought together people from the different sects in Bahrain, backgrounds, and essentially they unified to express their grievances and opposition to the imperialist form of rule that was, of course, anchored in controlling the territory through the ruling family. The more you have the development of the oil industry, the more you have a chance for the development also of workers' mobilizations at this stage, because there was a form of proletarianization going on sociologically across the region. As I mentioned earlier, in the case of Saudi Arabia, you had local workers being, exploited in the oil fields of Aramco. Same was happening in Bahrain. Later on, this changes, by the way. The oil companies start depending more and more on foreign labor increasingly. And that means that the population gets deproletarianized. You don't find them working in the major industrial production sites. They get absorbed into different sectors of the economy. What's interesting about this period in the 50s and the early 60s is that you still have a strong local working class in this region. And that's something that not many people think about when they think about the Gulf, unfortunately. Often there's this caricature of the Gulf, Daniel, as a region that is devoid of radical movements, that is devoid even of politics, and that is just like, a bunch of essentially rich people sitting around making money out of oil fields. But that's only one side of the story. There were very powerful movements that were trying to resist the emergence of this Las Vegas of the Middle East kind of model that exists there in parts of the Gulf today. Qatar has an interesting history. I mean, a friend of mine has actually published his memoirs a few years back. He's an old timer there. Now, in his case, he was active in the Ba'ath, but there were others that were active in the movement of Arab nationalists, and in other formations that had existed. There were also some communists in Qatar. Qatar's oil operations were also, oil and gas was very essential for understanding the labor mobilizations. There had been major strikes against the main oil company there, which is, of course, Royal Dutch Shell, that had taken place in Dukhan, which is the main area that my friend Ali Khalifa al-Kawari had worked in and he knew a lot about. And when you look at these memoirs like those of Ali Khalifa al-Kawari, what you find is there's a rich history where there's an intersection between the labor movement and the development also of literary societies, intellectual circles. You had these people essentially reading radical literature while at the same time being in proximity to the oil fields and to the labor movement. So there was this interesting cross-fertilization between an emerging intellectual class in Qatar, and we saw this in the form of societies. And by the way, in addition to literary clubs, you had the sports clubs that were acting as fronts for this. And I know many, sometimes we think of these sports clubs as just places where people get disengaged from politics. And that definitely is one way of engaging in sports. But in that period, actually, sports was used for very different means. It was used to attract the youth towards politics, and it was used as an arena for organizing. So you had also multiple strikes taking place in Qatar in this period that were driven by these kind of cross-fertilizations and intersections between thought and labor, and often you had these mediating spaces in which this took place. Certainly in the case of Qatar, it took place through these new formations. Now, one interesting thing about Qatar, Daniel, is that traditionally the government was pushing a Muslim Brotherhood line in educational circles, but sometimes they would take a step back and they would shift. And that happened in 1956, for example, when they wanted to display closer proximity to Nasser's Egypt. They went and then they brought in a couple of Arab nationalist educators into the main education ministry. So you had this back and forth there. It continues to be actually a country with a very strong presence for the Muslim Brotherhood. It has that heritage, it has that tradition. And by the way, Qatar traditionally was very close to the Saudi official religious ideology. It was a place that to this day, the big mosque there is the mosque of the Imam, which refers to Imam Abdel Wahab, the preacher that played a key role in the foundation of the Saudi state. So there is this heritage there that is very important. But as with Saudi, this relationship between religion and dynasty, there are ebbs and flows. And they may be closer overall to this outlook that, utilizes religion politically. However, there were moments, especially in the 1950s and during the rising tide of Nasserism, where they did signal different possibilities. Interestingly, often, when a state wanted to signal a shift, it did it through the Ministry of Education. And this is an important site for us to think about in this period, because there was a battle. How do you educate the kids about their identity? Are they primarily Muslims? Are they primarily Arabs? Are they primarily Arabs under colonialism? Are they just Qatari nationals or Saudi nationals? And you have this complex interplay between these different ideologies, and the battle over education was just as intense in a place like Qatar as it is in other parts of the world, including the United States, of course, where we live.
In 1962, Arab nationalists in North Yemen overthrew the ruling Zaydi imamate, sparking sparking a civil war that drew in Saudi arms to back the deposed royalists and troops from Nasser's Egypt to defend the new nationalist government. And the resulting war has been described as Egypt's Vietnam because it weakened its military ahead of the disastrous 1967 war with Israel. Lay out the basic history here of how this came about. What was the significance of the nationalist coup in North Yemen, and what then were the consequences of the civil war drawing in both Egypt and Saudi Arabia in the way that it did?
So there was a revolution, of course, in Yemen that took place in 1962 and that led to the overthrow and the deposition of the imam there. The imamate was the traditional system of rule, of course, in that country, as we have mentioned already. But there was a background to that, because this was not the first time the military had tried to intervene in the politics of the imamate. There was an attempt, in fact, a few years before, in 1955, at changing the course of the imamate's policies. And this attempt ultimately failed, but it produced internal fissures that were very significant. And also it led to the increasing withdrawal on the part of the Imam Ahmad bin Yahya, who had been dominating the country since 1948, since the year of the Nakba. So, ultimately he descended into complete withdrawal from public life and into serious drug addiction and various health problems. In any case, there was this dysfunction on the part of the ruler himself. The actual structure itself was not modernizing. And again, I hate using this term too much because it carries with it a lot of baggage. But, what we're referring to here is that you did not have the emergence of an effective set of state bureaucracies and structures. You did not have economic development policies that were increasing the growth of the economy.
His self-conscious agenda was to isolate Yemen from the so-called modern world.
Correct, in some ways, while also protecting it from new modern forces that were emerging regionally, including that of Nasser. So, you'll find this surprising, but Imam's son, Muhammad al-Badr, arrived at Nasser's door, literally being like, we want to join the United Arab Republic.
They formed some sort of weaker form of alliance with the UAR ultimately.
Right. But in fact, that was not really a serious situation. There was no compatibility at all between this imamate form and the sort of republicanism that Nasser was pushing. There were very different versions of rule and of the distribution of political power. So in any case, the crisis in Yemen, really exploded once the Imam Ahmad died in 1962, and once his son Muhammad al-Badr took rule. Now, he had been playing key roles for quite a while. He had been a defense minister and foreign minister, and he held various key roles. Okay, he was acting prime minister, but this new imam was basically not going to be able to control the forces in the army that sought a very radical switch in the politics of Yemen. And these were led by a colonel called Abdel Razzaq, who was very attracted to Nasser. And he also even espoused socialism that was, incompatible with the realities of an imamate that was very isolationist at the time. Now, Abdullah al-Badr tried to placate him by giving him important appointments, but that did not work, essentially. And you had a coup set up by Abdullah Salal. And that was, by the way, just one out of many coups attempts that were taking place around that time. It's just the one that succeeded, which tells you about the amount of discontent that was brewing internally within the state structures and within the army at the time. Now, once the coup took place, you had a situation where there was going to be a very, very difficult task confronting not just Yemen, but the whole region. Because Saudi Arabia was not going to sit around watching a Republican coup taking place just to the south of the country.
Why did Saudi Arabia see the revolution as such a threat?
I'll tell you something, Daniel. There are parts of Saudi Arabia today that were basically parts of Yemen in the past. And guess who played a key role in conquering them? King Faisal. So he had played a role. These are areas like Najran and so on. These are historically, part of Yemen. They get conquered, and Yemen is seen as very strategically important. For reasons that should be obvious to our listeners today if they've been following what's taken place over the past 10 years in the region. Yemen can have enormous impact. It is right at the entrance of the Red Sea. Okay, so you have a situation where it could block international trade. It has a very long border with Saudi Arabia. It can bomb, it can invade, it can... And the worry that Faisal had at the time was that, okay, so another monarchical regime has fallen, another dynastic regime has fallen. Iraq fell. Before it, Egypt fell. Jordan came close. And now you have Yemen next. And Yemen is right next door. So this could have a disastrous effect. What if it's going to be Saudi Arabia? And we know well from, just earlier in this episode that you had a movement within the Saudi royal family itself. The winds of change, the Nasserist wind of change was blowing so hard that even within the Saudi royal family itself, you had some princes calling for reform. Admittedly, that did not mean that they were calling for the fall of their own family or their next rule, but at least they wanted some transition to a constitutional monarchy. So for somebody like Faisal, this is all very dangerous, and it had to stop. It could mean the encroachment of Nasser's forces into Saudi Arabia. This became really a Republican monarchical clash on a regional scale also. Even Jordan was afraid at the time. So you have these monarchical forces mobilizing around those elements that were loyal to the Imam and that wanted to basically reverse the effects of the revolution. And then the Republican forces across the region rallied behind the Yemeni revolution at the time. Of course, as far as realist strategists were concerned, what this meant was, and here I'm talking about the imperialist ones, in the main colonial centers of power, including Washington. Their main fear was, if this goes unchecked, if this revolution really succeeds, then what it will do is it will threaten the oil fields of Saudi Arabia. It's not just pure alarmism. I mean, what if Nasser was able to establish a very strong foothold and alliance there through his very strong revolutionary commander there, Abdel Razzaq, and the alliance around him?
How had the relationship between Nasser and King Saud, who I think was still technically in control of Saudi Arabia in 1962, how did it get so bad? Because listeners will recall that for a long time in the 1950s, King Saud, Saudi Arabia, and Nasser were on the same side of fights over the Baghdad Pact and generally on the same side of a region-wide conflict with the Hashemite kingdoms of Jordan and Iraq. How did this relationship get so bad that it turned into essentially a proxy war in North Yemen? Or was it Faisal who was running the show already by this point?
Well, Faisal was running the show. Of course, he was a strong man in Saudi Arabia already at this stage. However, it's very important to note that the deterioration in relations predated even the start of the Yemeni revolution. So 1958 was really a turning point, because you had this situation where the main enemy had fallen. Okay, the common enemy, which was Hashemite Iraq, had fallen in a way that the Saudis did not want. Okay, I mean, ironically, this was their sworn enemy for a long time. This was their competitor, but they did not want the republic emerging in Iraq. There was this serious worry that if you have one republic emerging after the next, one monarchy falling after the next, then Saudi Arabia will be next. And this was a serious threat. So you have another dynamic happening, which is, of course, the UAR is established, which again creates a new reality. This is a major enhancement of Nasser's presence in the region. And geopolitically, it means its expansion to the eastern part of the region through his addition of Syria into the republic that he ruled, and it also meant that there was this, again, promotion of a new kind of ideology that was causing major enthusiasm. Pan-Arabism essentially was having its moment of ascendancy at this stage. And that was worrying a lot of monarchical regimes. There was pressures from especially the intellectual classes that were newly emerging across the Gulf region at the time. Sometimes there was pressure for these states to join the United Arab Republic. Famously in Kuwait, there was a big speech on the part of one of the leaders of the movement of Arab nationalists, Jassim al-Ghatami, who, by the way, was a former chief of police, and he had resigned over Suez for refusing to put down the popular mobilizations that were launched against the British in Kuwait during Suez. So Jassim Ghatami, this former chief of police, comes in and says, I dream of the day when the flags of unity would be flying over us here in Kuwait, and that leads to a major clash. So you have this atmosphere brewing across the region. The Saudis are worried. The internal pressures that they're getting from within their family, from outside their family, these are making them get worried as well. So, and Nasser is also becoming increasingly bolder in his articulations, and his clash with the British is getting increasingly stronger. So, all of this is of concern for the Saudis. The circumstances that they had before for an alliance had fallen apart. Now, Yemen, however, was just too close to home. So that's why the minute you had this revolutionary coup take place there in 1962, the Saudis immediately amassed troops across the border. They start giving bribes to tribal leaders that were connected to the imamate. Essentially, they start feeding a civil war. And Nasser intervenes in support of the revolutionary forces there by sending troops directly. And it's not a small number. He's sending initially 20,000 or so soldiers, and the numbers grow, and the logistical complexities grow, the losses grow. It becomes a quagmire. It becomes a total trap that he's unable to get out of. In the meantime, of course, the Saudis have more money and resources, and they're pumping a lot of this into this kind of engagement there. You have also mercenaries being involved from the West. You have these British mercenaries. You have the Americans involved. The Americans are involved in multiple ways. The most important and the most telling for us, like in terms of the overall story we're telling about the region, is that they make it pretty clear, and they announce it very firmly, that they will not tolerate any threat to Saudi Arabia's integrity or sovereignty. and that they will intervene in which case. And they even, do like a show of force. But at the same time, you have this American realistic game being played where they're like, okay, maybe we should be a bit more, concerned with the realpolitik here. The revolution did happen. There's no need for for Saudi insistence on the imam to come back, or restoration of the old regime should not be the new purpose. But it should be that reducing the radical nature of it and ensuring Egyptian withdrawal. That's their number one priority at this stage. Because if they can do that, then they can perhaps basically entice Yemen into entry into the Western orbit at least, or maybe neutralize it. So that's the game they're playing, even though of course they're backing their allies, the Saudi Arabians.
And indeed, North Yemen ultimately does, after the civil war, play both sides of the Cold War to some extent.
Absolutely. I mean, and then who will supply weapons to the army becomes like this game essentially. Like, will it be the Soviets? Will it be the Americans? Will it be both? So there are all these Cold War games that are played by small states like North Yemen, the small states that have key strategic locations, however, that are very fascinating. And again, sometimes it's easy for people to forget. This is where some of the world's largest, in fact, the largest oil reserves that are held by any one major oil exporting country are in this region. There's Saudi oil here, there's Kuwaiti oil, there's Iraqi oil, there's Iranian oil, and Saudi oil is the biggest of them all.
Which makes Saudi Arabia the political, economic, military center of gravity of the entire Arabian Peninsula, hitched to the most powerful force in the world, the post-World War II United States.
Correct. And of course, good old Noam Chomsky always references this, this statement. Americans were pretty clear. They were saying it publicly that Middle East oil is the greatest prize, economic prize in history. And much of that is in Saudi Arabia. So this is a side of the story of global political economy and of global politics and geopolitics that we often take for granted because this alliance has been so solid for so many years. It has never stopped. Okay, this relationship has deep structural roots, and it has to do with the control of this resource and the defense of it against any regional force that was going to potentially threaten it. And what we mean by threaten it is any regional force that was going to threaten the dynasty, which is the royal family and that monarchical form of rule, was seen by the United States as a major destabilizing threat for its main interest in this whole region, which is this oil. Now, it has other interests too, but they're of a very different nature. And sometimes I have arguments with people over this. They come and tell you, well, they need Israel for this oil, and anybody that actually studies Saudi history and studies it from the Gulf side knows that Israel was actually a hassle. It was a headache for the Americans in terms of managing and protecting this resource. It was not very useful for them actually on that front. But it's hard to explain this to people because you'd have to go through the documents. But the Israeli side is an interest in its own right. Okay, so you have the Saudi interest is the most important and clear economically. Then you have culturally based interests and domestically based interests like the Israeli one that also are important. And of course, you have Iran and Turkey and other countries like that playing key roles in the Cold War geopolitically as well. So there's a lot of interest in this region. But Saudi Arabia is numero uno.
How did North Yemen's civil war and the involvement of Egypt and Saudi Arabia finally come to an end? And then more specifically, what was the significance and what were the ultimate consequences of this moment of Egypt's intervention in North Yemen and the way it played out? What was the significance of all that in the long arc of Nasser and Nasserism's stature in the region that we've spent so much of this series discussing. Listeners will recall that Nasserism was riding high in so many ways in the mid to late 1950s, with victories at Suez and over the Baghdad Pact, and then with the realization of the United Arab Republic. Syria's secession from the UAR was then a huge blow. Where did the war in Yemen, in North Yemen, and the way it played out, where does that fit into the story of Nasserism and Nasser's Egypt?
Well, I mean, it was disastrous because the war in Yemen led to, first of all, the rise of a new geostrategic polarization in the region, or the cementing of that polarization. Already you had the Saudi opposition to Egypt developing from 58, as I mentioned earlier, but it gets cemented after 62, and it becomes a serious issue. And that has, its own logic that we've tried to explore. But as this gets cemented, then you have the Nasserist position against monarchies gets more and more hardline at this stage. He starts actually promoting anti-monarchical ideology. Even though in the 50s, it's interesting, he had a slightly different line. He used to distinguish between anti-colonial monarchs and ones that were not so. For example, he supported Mohammed V in Morocco when he was exiled by the French, on the grounds that you could have monarchs sometimes playing anti-colonial roles. But after the start of the Yemeni revolution, and then its descent into Yemeni civil war that was sponsored by Saudi Arabia in many ways, you had a situation where he's going after monarchy as a concept very and openly talking about that regularly. You have a situation where the Yemenis are boasting about bombing Saudi Arabia, and they're announcing that the next move would be to destroy its royal family and their residences and their houses and all of that and their palaces. And you have also a situation where the Egyptian forces themselves are bombing areas that are on the Saudi-Yemeni border. So this is a very, very difficult, intense moment. What it means is also an incredible financial burden for Egypt and an incredible military burden for Egypt. And it's a major distraction from the main national security threat that Egypt was facing, Israel. Remember, this was at a time when Egypt still had not regained full sovereignty over its occupied territory that it lost in 56. Over Sinai. It could not move troops freely. It had a whole monitoring regime, UN monitoring regime there. It was very complex. Egypt was still facing a country that had just attacked it, and successfully. And of course, with the support of Britain and France and direct involvement from them. It was a tripartite aggression. But this is a very serious force to contend with. It's a settler colony that had militarily, undermined Egypt twice over the course of less than 14 years, from between 48 and 62. So to go away from that and get embroiled in Yemen, far away Yemen, but also rough terrain Yemen, unconquerable Yemen, an area that is essentially the graveyard of anybody that has ever tried to intervene in it. The Ottomans remember their times in Yemen. There's still songs in Turkish now about the Yemen campaign. The British lost heavily in Yemen, of course, in South Yemen later on, and we can tell that story. This is like Afghanistan. It's a very rough terrain. It's mountainous. It has a social composition that is very much opposed to external intervention. And here in this case, you have the Saudis pumping huge amounts of money into the project of undermining the Republic. So what this means is the actual serious direct threat on the border, which is the Israeli one, is benefiting from the fact that a much more distant arena is being fought in by Egyptian forces. And they're increasingly fighting a force that they cannot really conclusively win over, because this is rough guerrilla warfare. So essentially, you have a situation throughout where it was clear that what's going to ultimately happen is a stalemate. And the stalemate had already become clear, by the time we hit the mid-60s. It was clear that there's no serious progress being made. The royalists are not able to overthrow the republic, and the republic is not going to be able to completely destroy the Saudi front. Now, Egypt was essentially getting more and more embroiled despite the stalemate. So they started off with under 20,000 troops. By the mid-50s, when things were stale, they had 60,000. It's crazy, Daniel. And Nasser understands this, because this is having a direct economic impact on him. He's having to impose defense taxes. It's a very expensive war at this stage. So he has an interest in doing some, engagement over Yemen with the Saudis. Now, there is also a great power, Cold War superpower involvement in this. There is that dimension. Because interestingly and weirdly, the Americans really did not want this to go out of control completely, precisely because they cared about this region and its oil reserves. So they were trying to broker some kind of Nasser Faisal agreement over this that would save face for them. And there was a lot of pressure on Nasser on this, because the Americans, despite the fact that he had clashed with them over multiple arenas, they still had leeway over him in some ways. For example, they were providing important food supplies for Egypt through a special program that supplied it with wheat. And Egypt had some level of dependency on them in that regard. So there was pressure. They couldn't just say, no, we're not going to engage completely in this. So in any case, you have talks that go on, but they ultimately do not produce a final end to this. What does produce a final end to the Egyptian presence in Yemen and essentially this big clash between Saudi Arabia and Yemen and Egypt over Yemen was the 67 war. When the 67 war happens, it changes the entire equation in the region. Nasser now needs Faisal again, okay, because he needs to rearm, he needs to refocus on the big direct enemy, and he does not have the money for that. And he definitely had come out of the war depleted and weakened in significant ways. So he needs to close this Yemeni front. And he does close it. And the way he closes it is through essentially a rapprochement with Faisal during and in the context of dealing with the aftermath of 67. So it's in the Khartoum summit that produces the famous Khartoum resolution, what was called Mahwu Athar al-Udwan, the erasure of the effects of the aggression. And that produced the 3 no's of Khartoum. We can talk about that later when we talk about 67. It's during there that Egypt announces its willingness to end the war, basically.
Earlier in this interview, you said that Faisal always had the stronger hand in terms of the battle over the future of Saudi Arabia between him on the one hand, the Free Princes on the other, and Saud in the middle. How did Faisal ultimately force his brother from power? And we'll return to this in the final episode of our series, I think, but what were the long-term implications of this conservative victory?
Saud was not less conservative than Faisal, I should note. What he was a bit less determined, a little bit less focused. So I'll give you an example, Daniel. Saud tried to sponsor an assassination attempt on Jamal Abdel Nasser in 1958. He's not less opposed to Jamal Abdel Nasser than his brother. He began to see Abdel Nasser as a major threat. And it's not like he was ever like really progressive or anything like that. What he was far less efficient than Faisal, far less exposed to the world. It's interesting. They're two brothers from two different mothers, of course. The difference between them is a mere 4 years. But the third son was generally seen as wiser, more worldly. He had received a hardcore intellectual education of a religious nature at his mom's family's, home. His mom died young, so he ended up with his grandparents. He gets this education. He's sent early on to all of these international places. Like he goes on a kind of a tour of Britain that's sponsored by the British government. As a young man, 13 years old, he spends like several months there, like 5 months or so, maybe a bit more even. He spends some time in France. He goes to many different countries. He becomes a foreign minister. Okay, so he's serving in key posts and has major international exposure. And when Abdulaziz was thinking about who's going to succeed him, for a long time he had considered Faisal on the basis of ability, but eventually gave it to Saud on the basis of primogeniture and seniority, because he wanted to set a precedent possibly around that. Now, that said, it became clear that Saud was not capable of confronting the challenges of this region at this stage. He had mismanaged the finances, like we mentioned earlier, did not have a clear strategy, and Faisal was offering a clear strategy out of it. As he built an internal coalition around him that grew in strength, that coalition began putting more pressure on Saud to abdicate. And by 1964, we have this abdication taking place. The coalition included people who were very prominent in the religious establishment, as well as princes who were very prominent in the family. The senior-most brothers were increasingly trusting Faisal more with the management of family affairs. And ultimately, all their fates were hanging on having good leadership at the top position. So, and what good leadership meant for these people was conservative leadership, remember. It was leadership that was going to be able to prevent revolutionary change in Saudi Arabia. It was going to be an effective counter-revolutionary leadership, but also one that is technocratically capable on some levels in terms of managing the oil industry and its revenues and managing the external relations that are required around that. So, and Faisal was able to provide that leadership.
You said that Saud was not less conservative than his brother Faisal. Would you still, though, describe Faisal's victory over Saud as signaling in various ways the end of an era that was more open to reform?
They both come from a conservative outlook. These are people that believed in monarchy. These are people that believed in the dynasty ruling. They believed in the dynasty controlling most of the resources of the country and splitting it amongst themselves. So all what I'm saying is, that's one dimension of the story. However, Faisal has a program of encouraging regional conservatism for the purpose of strengthening the politics of dynastic rule. And what that means is offering alternatives to the Nasserist grand secular vision in the region, which was pan-Arabism. So he starts, for example, the big push for the creation of the Organization of the Islamic Conference. He starts this push for reactivating Islam as a regional force. And of course, the Americans are backing this vision with him. They love it at this stage.
What could go wrong?
Yeah, exactly. And this is something that I would like to remind our listeners of. The U.S. loves these conservative religious visions. It was doing them across the world at this stage. They're backing this project big time, and because they want to find an alternative to revolutionary secular pan-Arabism at this stage. So that's why the victory of Faisal was a victory for conservatism, because it allowed a focused, effective, and powerful conservative figure to come in and take charge. Now, interestingly, this powerful conservative figure who is normally very pro-American on most fronts, the one area where he has some common ground with Nasser is Palestine. Despite the fact, by the way, that he paved the way for a big defeat in 1967 by embroiling Nasser in the Yemeni quagmire, he did not do it to serve Israel, and he was quite upset when it did. Faisal was far more committed to that question, for example, along anti-colonial lines than any of the Saudi kings that came after him. However, he came at it from a slightly different angle. For him, even his vision around Palestine was driven by a conservative vision. So he thought of it, in Islamic ways. He thought of it in terms of that this is basically an Islamic Arab land that has been usurped. That's how he thought of it, which is different than, let's say, a bigger third worldist way of approaching Palestine, that would see it as part of a universal project to liberate humanity from the forces of empire and settler colonialism.
And Faisal's victory for sure meant the end of the influence of people like the Free Princes or the Red Sheikh Abdullah Takriti.
Of course, these are all gone. But already part of his rise to power was the marginalization of these figures. He was not going to accept that Saudi Arabia becomes governed by people that have attachments that could collide with monarchy, or the principle of monarchy, or the principle of unchecked monarchical rule. All these people that now try to reconsider characters like Faisal, they forget that we should always be able to distinguish between efficiency, technical capacity, and overall political philosophy. We need to know what the political philosophy is. At best, he was a promoter of enlightened despotism, and not so enlightened when it came to personal status or personal liberties, or quite the opposite on that front. Okay, but enlightened despotism, as in a more efficient state structure emerging under despotism,
modernizing despotism.
But I'm saying at best, if you want to really view it as some great thing, which some people now are trying to do that, there are these people. It's weird, Daniel. There is a trend now where people are getting attached to characters like that, and I guess it's a sign because things have gotten so bad recently that people like Faisal appear like great characters all of a sudden for some people.
Which sorts of people are attracted to Faisal as a figure?
Within Saudi Arabia, there is a big trend of some Saudi scholars that have tried to rehabilitate him in recent years. Some people paint him as an alternative to Nasser, as Nasser was actually on the wrong in their view in this whole clash. So there are all sorts of projects that seek that. But No doubt, he was a fascinating and complicated character. But we should always be clear about what the ideology driving him was.
If King Saud was not less conservative than Faisal, why was King Saud open to the Free Princes proposing a constitution or Takriti doing all of his stuff? Why was he more open to it?
Because he was, we want the honest answer,
Yeah.
and again, we can't because he was more random. The dude was
He was just
not
less
as
decisive.
alert.
Yeah.
Yeah, dude, and less knowledgeable. He did not fucking understand what this meant.
Yeah.
He's a more random character. By the way, Faisal was very smart, Daniel. He was a very smart, very savvy figure, and he was alert, and he understood power,
He's the leader that the counter-revolutionary project needed.
Absolutely.
It was either going to go in a totally different way or it was going to become a better counter-revolutionary project.
Yeah, essentially. And the counter-revolutionaries did not want to fuck up the counter-revolution.
Right.
By having somebody who's literally incompetent. And Saud was, by the way, reputedly very good-hearted. He was a kind-hearted guy who did not know how to say no.
Yeah.
So people would come with random requests for money and whatever. He'd be like, yeah, sure, yeah, do you want that? He's that kind of character. And Daniel, by the way, some of the most fascinating, aspects of the story were covered by Abdurrahman Munif, the brilliant Saudi novelist, who was, of course, a radical thinker and writer. And he wrote this incredible 5-part novel, Cities of Salt. I believe only 3 have been translated to English. I don't know if the rest of them were, but unfortunately, this drama gets covered in the later ones. So who knows if they're out in English. There is a character in the novel that is basically Faisal, and he really captures this character really well, as well as Saud. Of course, it's all set in a fictional setting and under a different name. But everybody that knows anything about it knows that it's referring to Saudi Arabia and its political history.
Let's close this conversation by talking about the Trucial States, the small emirates known as such because they have these treaties that made them British protectorates. And these are the states that later together become the United Arab Emirates. You wrote a really interesting article about 2 coups that you describe as colonial coups during this era. One in Sharjah and the other in Abu Dhabi. In Sharjah in 1965, the Sheikh was overthrown because he embraced Nasserist, anti-British imperialist Arab nationalism. In 1966, the British ousted the Sheikh of Abu Dhabi for being so reactionary that he stood in the way of what the British deemed to be necessary progress. What did these 2 coups, staged for different reasons against 2 very different rulers, what did that reveal about overall how British colonial power was helping to make the Trucial States into the super wealthy, powerful, very small post-colonial states that today we know as the UAE?
Yeah. So you have a situation here where you have very small 7 emirates, essentially, under British control. And this is, again, before the British had announced their withdrawal from the Gulf in 1968. And of course, it was a process that only gets fully actualized in 71. So we have a situation where the British are essentially saying, we're not going to allow Nasser a foothold in this region. He had articulated a very clear regional program, and articulated maybe is the wrong word. He was practicing a very clear regional program that they understood very well, which is essentially focused on the notion of imposing withdrawal, imposing both British and French withdrawal from the region. French withdrawal primarily from the North African a part of the Arab-speaking region, which meant Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco. And of course, much of that happened in the mid-50s. And then, of course, it happened in Algeria, which is the most difficult case because of its settler-colonial nature that takes place in 1962. But then, you have, on the British side, it's primarily the Arabian Peninsula, where the British were yet to withdraw. And in particular, those Gulf small states that they had controlled. The only place that had received independence early on, relatively speaking, was Kuwait. And Kuwait had its own particularities. We've talked about them extensively before. It receives independence in 1961. It has a developed political life, but also it has a developed economic system as a result of the major oil boom that had taken place in the 1950s. The oil production was huge for a small state with such big reserves. This produced tons of wealth, and there was enough pressure internally to get the British out, but also the British felt that this was the best option possible for them, given the overall realities in the region and the balance of power there. If they were to fully prevent independence of a place like Kuwait, then eventually they'll have to contend with pro-Nasserist forces that could undermine the ruling family in a place like that. Now, the same rule applied to the rest of the region, except that the revenues were still not yet being received in what became the Emirates at the same level of that of Kuwait. The one exception, which was really promising, was Abu Dhabi. Okay, so these Emirates, which are by order of importance, the most important three are Abu Dhabi and Dubai and then Sharjah, and then followed by smaller Emirates, Ras Al Khaimah, Ajman, Al Quwain, and Fujairah. These Emirates, the one that has the biggest wealth is Abu Dhabi. The one that is strategically important at this stage for the British in terms of for military purposes is Sharjah, because they have the RAF base there. And that's the one that is most advanced intellectually and culturally because of the kind of rule that was pursued by its leader at the time, Sheikh Saqr al-Qasimi, who gets deposed by the British. He was a poet, he was an intellectual, encouraged, invested heavily in education, and was very, very drawn to the figure of Jamal Abdel Nasser, but also to the political program that he was sponsoring.
The situation in Sharjah must be alarming for the British. They want monarchies to protect the reigning orders and reigning interests. And yet here, there's a monarch who is himself attracted to Nasser, the region's leading anti-monarchy, anti-colonial rebel.
The British there were confronting a dilemma that was, in a sense, more difficult than that even of Kuwait. Because they're like, okay, at least in Kuwait we could leave, but we leave intact a strong ruling family that will ultimately still be attached to us. It has major investments in London. Throughout the 50s, by the way, Kuwait effectively stabilized sterling, because these extra oil revenues meant that you could keep these currencies, like this currency that came out of the Second World War in a serious crisis. Through these revenues, you can stabilize that currency. So, we have a situation where you want to ensure that this formula of enough liberalization, to allow for some local participation in aspects of economic and political life without actually achieving democracy, which would mean the end to British or Western control.
And both Sharjah and Abu Dhabi's sheikhs were missing the mark from different directions.
Right, because one was going too far in the anti-colonial side of things, he was following the popular demands too much by aligning or wanting to align with Egypt and Nasser, by wanting to expel the British, and by promoting pan-Arabist ideas openly and in a very strong way. And then you have another one just refusing any effective developmental policy. And even though he had massive revenues coming now from the oil company, he was not investing them adequately locally, and certainly not involving anybody in the ruling process.
And the British basically conspired with different centers of power in the royal family to oust these rulers and put them on a plane out of town?
In Abu Dhabi, they had a clear candidate, the brother of Sheikh Shakhbout, who was the ruler at the time that they deposed. Okay, and that brother was Sheikh Zayed,
the father of Mohammed bin Zayed.
The father of Mohammed bin Zayed, MBZ, son of Zayed, yes. And of course, Zayed is celebrated as the founder of modern day UAE, and there's all sorts of things named after him. But Zayed was actually a very shrewd and very prominent member of the family. He was ruling Abu Dhabi's side of the Buraimi oasis, and the British liked him because he ran things well. He was effective. Again, it's similar to this Faisal dilemma that you have in Saudi Arabia, that you have an effective brother who can protect the family and the dynasty in effective ways, but they're not in charge. And in the meantime, you have the kind of useless brother who's like messing around and is not being very efficient, being given all the resources and being in control. So the one thing, though, was in this case, you also have, and this is a bit that I think feminist historians will one day write a lot about. You also have a mother who is very powerful in Abu Dhabi politics, and she is preventing the removal of the son who is in charge for a long time. And she made even all her sons vow to her that they're not gonna play this game of removing Shakhbout. And this has to do with her fears around Abu Dhabi's history, which, by the way, was very bloody. Within the family, there had long been feuds over who's going to be the ruler. And the same, slightly less bloody version was happening in this was the Al Nahyan family in Abu Dhabi. Fratricide was pretty common in their political history for much of the past couple of centuries. Whereas in the case of the Qasimi family, which was ruling Sharjah, there had been a big conflict between two wings of the family, and essentially the British come in and say, okay, we need to favor the wing that's against Saqr. And in the case of Saqr, his problem is not inefficiency, it's not lack of enlightenment, it's not lack of vision. He has all of these. It's that he has too much, which means that he's aspiring for real independence and for alignment with Egypt, and for, he subscribes to the big pan-Arabist ideal, an anti-imperialist ideal. This was somebody who was writing also poems for Algeria and Palestine, and poems for Arabism and so on and so forth. He did have some tensions with Nasser, but loved him dearly. The one area where they differed was over socialism. And in fact, he used to use that to try to pretend to British officials that he's not fully aligned with Nasser, because he would come and say, look, how can I be aligned with somebody who wants to make me a pauper? I'm against socialism in all its forms, so I can't be for Nasser. But in reality, of course, he was definitely aligned with the Nasserist vision for the region. Now, the one dimension that is important to note here is that part of what drove him into this alignment was that he really wanted development money in Sharjah, and the British were not giving it. And I want people to know this, because the British always pretended they built schools and did education and they spread good things wherever they ruled and all of that stuff. What anybody who knows anything about the history of this part of the world will tell you is that in all of these places, they did not want to spend a cent on education, on health. The rulers of these places were finding themselves lacking in any of these resources. Poverty was widespread. It was extreme. And that's why, Sheikh Saqr was trying to find alternatives for his small, poor emirate. He was trying to find an exit away from this nightmare of British dominance that was making his people poor, basically. In addition, of course, to perpetuating imperial dominance. So Nasser, through the Arab League, had proposed a development plan for the Trucial States. And he was willing to essentially collect funds for that purpose and to offer development experts that will help in the realms of education, irrigation, other fields. And once they sent this technical committee on the part of the Arab League, the British freak out, because they're like, this is intervention in a British zone. Britain controls the foreign affairs of these countries. There should not be anybody talking to them about anything. And in the meantime, of course, Sheikh Saqr is doing big celebrations to celebrate the arrival of the Arab League Committee. And, there's all these demonstrations in Sharjah and so on. So in the aftermath of that, they make a decision and they're like, okay, we're removing this guy. And essentially they engage in a palace coup. They take him out and they put him on a plane and deport him. Eventually he finds his way to Cairo, where he basically lives for a very long time. Then he makes a comeback where we don't have to go into that, but like he makes a comeback and actually ends up killing the brother who deposed him, but that's another story. Anyways, on the other side of the equation, you have Sheikh Shakhbout, who was so reactionary. And again, you have these people now trying to rehabilitate them. There's this weird habit among scholars where they want to rehabilitate people like that, and they want to pretend that they're not as reactionary as we thought they were. And I'm like, no, they actually were. Like, I would argue that they were worse than what scholarship has suggested even. Doesn't mean that you can't understand why they thought of their world in those terms. But the reality is Shakhbout did not have a vision for economic modernization. And that was a problem for the British. They did not have a problem with him not having a vision for political modernization. So they wanted economic development and they wanted wealth to come to those countries, because some wealth coming to those countries was going to ensure a lot of wealth coming to the oil companies and ultimately to the countries out of which they operate, i.e. Britain. It would also guarantee the geopolitical alignment of this region with Britain for the long haul, and with the Western project as a whole, actually.
That was the 12th episode of Thawra, the Dig's series on 20th century Arab politics with Abdel Razzaq Takriti, who teaches history at Rice University. A scholar of Arab and Palestinian revolutionary movements, he's the author of Monsoon Revolution, Republicans, Sultans, and Empires in Oman, and the co-author of the Palestinian Revolution Digital Humanities website, an incredible resource that'll be back online soon. Thank you for listening to The Dig from Jacobin Magazine. As Marx once said, after noting that revolutions are the locomotives of history, While other podcasts simply interpreted the world in various ways, our point is to change it. We're posting new episodes every week. The Dig was produced by Alex Lewis. Our associate producer is Jackson Roach. Music by Jeffrey Brodsky. Our communications coordinator is Sylvia Atwood. Our senior advisors are Thea Rio-Francos and Ben Mabey. Check out our vast archives and newsletters at thedigradio.com. Follow us on Twitter and also now Instagram at thedigradio. And please find us wherever you get podcasts and subscribe to this podcast. If it is on iTunes or Spotify or wherever, also please rate and review us. Those reviews help introduce us to new listeners. But what really does that is you telling new people to check out the pod. People you know IRL, people you know on the internet, whatever. Please make propaganda for us. And do find us at patreon.com and make a monthly or annual contribution to keep this operation up and running strong. Even a few bucks is huge.